Okay, so good morning. Today I will be presenting something about what we can do about watershed land use. So we will be discussing a few trends already and a few studies regarding watershed land use and of course BOED watershed. Then we will be discussing how far we've come, okay, with BOED watershed, what are the data that we already have, what are the things that we were already able to do, okay, for us to be able to determine how to approach watershed land use for BOED watershed. Then, of course, we will be talking about our new goals, okay, what we will be doing in the next months for us to be able to come up with an appropriate or an ideal land use for the proper management of BOED watershed, which will also be discussed in the next steps that we should take in watershed land use or watershed management. So for our agenda, okay, of the discussion, we will be talking about the status quo. Okay, what is the status quo right now with our watershed and with land use planning? So we now go to the discussions. So for the status quo of the influence of land use to hydrology, land use planning and management is essential in maximizing the opportunities for a piece of land as well as the conservation of natural resources and natural ecosystems. With that said, we can say that land use influences hydrology, biology, and functional attributes of freshwater ecosystems. So, land use information is now widely recognized as a good indicator of human impacts on riverine systems. Therefore, a complete inventory of land use and point source in the watershed is a critical component of a watershed monitoring program aimed at understanding sources of pollutants to streams, lakes, and reservoirs. Okay, so we have our CLUP from Baguio City, we have our CLUP from Tuba. I think we can also get the development plan of the whole Cordillera regional development plan. So we can see if the CLUP of Baguio and Tuba is actually aligned to the goals of the regional development plan. It doesn't have to be the whole city or the whole municipality, but when it comes, of course, to watershed preservation or watershed management. So we go now to the status quo of land use planning. So land use planning in the Philippines. What is the status of land use planning in the Philippines? Now, there was actually a study conducted by a German company on how land use planning is being done in the Philippines. They were able to come up with a list of issues and problems in current land use planning processes that impedes efficient and effective development in the Philippines. So these are the following findings that led to their recommendation towards a consistent national policy framework to land use planning. So, excuse me. First is the complexity of developing comprehensive land use plans. So, they have to update this. Excuse me. They have to update this. So, sometimes when administration changes, they have to update this, and they have to subsequently reinforce or enforce this CLUP, but that becomes challenging for municipal planning administrators. So there should be training of municipal staff, so that should be a prerequisite for a successful planning and implementation. Next is we have planning or plan development and implementation should be based on objective criteria and align with people's need. So decoupling land use planning from the interests of executive officers and powerful landowners is essential and contributes to the common good. So there are some cases that sometimes, okay, I'm not saying that this is applicable to Baguio City and Tuba CLUP, that the judgment of policymakers or our authorities who are making the CLUP are clouded by personal interests or the interests of their colleagues or executive officers and some powerful landowners. Okay, so we should ensure that the CLUPs or development plans should be aligned, or it should contribute to the betterment of the environment or of the people, the interest of the people or of the environment. Next is land use planning or physical planning and development planning require alignment. So this is what I was talking about earlier in the second bullet. So the existing mismatch is a consequence of different and overlapping mandates between governmental authorities. So I was thinking that for the activity for this afternoon, we would be able to see these overlaps of the CLUP from Tuba and of Baguio City. It doesn't have to be, again, on a municipal scale, but the policies that actually affects the Buwed watershed. Okay, so it would be nice, okay, in the future probably, if leaders of municipals would talk about how to approach or how to create policies that could affect the Buwed watershed. So it doesn't have to be, okay, in a municipal scale that they have to talk about their CLUP, but since Buwed watershed runs from one municipality to another, okay, perhaps municipal leaders, okay, could talk how they would be formulating their CLUP or their land use models or their land use plans, okay, for the betterment of the watershed or of the Buwed watershed. Okay. So next is we have incomplete and outdated cadastral information and shortcomings in sectoral information exchange inhibit the steps necessary to solve pressing issue of insecure tenure rights. And lastly, cooperation of agency is currently partial and not yet systematic. So with this, it hampers a consistent alignment of plans and integration of efforts in the country. So CLUP formulation, okay, affects not only the land, of course, the land resources of a municipality, but also other environmental resources like your watersheds, our protected forest areas or forested areas. Okay, so with drastic and rampant changes in land use cover occurring in Baguio City, and as stated in the study, policymakers and land use planners in the LGUs must be guided. Okay, so next is we have this is further reinforced by DENR on policy recommendations. So the result of vulnerability assessment should be presented to the local government units for incorporation to their respective comprehensive land use plans or CLUPs and other development plans. Further, declaration of unbuildable zones, allocation of resettlement areas, and proper zoning and land use allocation should be aligned and anchored to their zoning ordinance. Localization of policies regulating unlawful occupation and environmental destruction within the declared strict protection zones, and creation of anti-environmental crime task force for the watershed. Moreover, I was not able to include this, but RDC or the Regional Development Council also has an executive committee resolution number 29, which was released just last year. This is endorsing the National Research Council of the Philippines for institutional grant support the research proposal ensuring water security and climate resilience for mountain indigenous communities of the Cordillera through technology-enhanced decision support tools. So, our project or our program falls or is ideal, is very much aligned to this resolution of the Regional Development Council. So next is we go to the Buwed watershed. So what is the status quo of Buwed watershed right now? So Buwed watershed, okay, is heavily silted and is occasionally dredged. It has been the drainage of mine tailings from copper and gold mines in Tuba Benguet, landslides along Cannon Road, including quarrying and aggregates crushing plants in riversides, release silt and sand into the river, thus affecting Buwed watershed. Okay, the Agat Bridge, which serves as the highway boundary between the towns of Sison and Rosario, spans several hundred meters due to the widening of the river. The river overflows especially during strong rains and typhoons. So, this is the current status quo of Buwed watershed. Moreover, a recent study of DNR, which characterized Buwed watershed from January 2020 to September 2020, also showed the current status of Buwed watershed. So let's go into that. So when in the characterization of Buwed watershed, we have different stations which are located from Camp 1 to Amilang Creek. So that's Camp 1, Twin Peaks Bridge, Colorado Bridge, Camp 3, Camp 4, and so on and so forth. So they were able to take samples on all of these stations, and they were able to take the nitrate levels, the phosphate levels of the Buwed watershed, the TSS or the total suspended solids, also the temperature of the water, and other characteristics. But some of the factors that characterizes Buwed watershed was not significant, that it has a negative impact on Buwed watershed. However, these are the three, which is nitrate, phosphate, and total suspended solids that were at high levels that already has a negative impact on the quality of water in Buwed watershed. So first is we go to nitrate. So again, this data was taken from January 2020 to September 2020, and these are the nitrate levels on different stations. So nitrate is nitrate in underground originates. Let me repeat that. Nitrate in groundwater originates primarily from fertilizers, septic systems, and manure storage of spreading operations. So fertilizer nitrogen that is not taken up by plants, volatilized or carried away by surface runoff leaches to the groundwater in the form of nitrate. This not only makes the nitrogen unavailable to crops, but also can elevate the concentration in groundwater above the levels acceptable for drinking water quality. So nitrogen from manure similarly can be lost from fields, barnyards, and storage locations. Septic systems can also elevate groundwater nitrate concentrations because they remove only half of the nitrogen in wastewater, leaving the remaining half to percolate to groundwater. So based on this graph, this was conducted, so it shows that Bued River watershed have a nitrate content of more than 10, which this reflects that the watershed exceeds the standard nitrate content for drinking water, which is only 10. So this is beyond water quality guidelines. So next is we go to total suspended solids. So again, the data shows, this shows data from January 2022 to September 2022. So total suspended solids, so basically these are solids or substances suspended in water, including clay, silt from soil erosion, decaying plant, algae, plankton, sand, microbes, animal matter, industrial waste, and sewage that cause water turbidity. So as levels of TSS increase, a water body begins to lose its ability to support a diversity of aquatic life. Suspended solids absorb heat from sunlight, which increases water temperature and subsequently decreases the levels of oxygen that is needed by aquatic life in water, since warmer water holds basically less oxygen than cooler water. Suspended solids settle to the bottom and eventually blanket the riverbed, causing damage to fish habitat and aquatic insects. The water quality guideline for Class C freshwater system is not more than 80 of the result of the uppermost portion of the river. In the case of the Bued River, station B13A, so we can see B13A, that is the reference station as it is the uppermost portion of the Bued River. So this figure shows the TSS values obtained from all sampling stations. So we can see that the TSS loads of the sampling stations in Bued River range from less than 1 to a high of 3,740. So most of these samples collected exceeded the standards of Class C fresh waters. So TSS loads that highly exceed the standards are proximate to active mining activities. So other contributory to the exceedance of the TSS are from sediments from sand and gravel, soil erosion, and mass movements attributed to the July 1990 earthquake. Also, more contributing factors to the TSS load were the solid and liquid waste that are directly dumped and discharged into the river system. So probably we can also take a look at the residential areas that are built near the watershed and investigate their sewage system. Okay, or probably if each municipal has data on this, then much better. So next is we go to the phosphate levels. Okay, so for phosphate, so the water quality guideline has only a recommendation of 0.5. So we can see that a lot of data on this figure that was taken January 2020 to September 2020 goes beyond the water quality guideline for phosphate levels. So although aquatic plants need nutrients like phosphorus for growth, increased levels of these nutrients in water bodies can cause excessive plant growth rates, leading to algal blooms and nuisance weeds, which reduce the recreational and aesthetic value of bodies of water or water bodies. When excess algae eventually die and start to decompose by oxidation, the water is depleted of the oxygen that is needed by aquatic life and may result to asphyxiation of fishes and other living organisms in the bodies of water. So dead algae now can contribute to foul-tasting, green, and slimy water. So phosphates are nutrients that come from both natural and anthropogenic sources that include detergents, fertilizers, raw sewage, and wastewater. So in the figure, this presents the concentration of phosphates within Bued River. The water quality guideline for, again, Class C freshwater is 0.5, as I mentioned earlier. The highest reading was at station B10 for the month of March, followed by B12 in the same month. The elevated levels of phosphate may have come from fertilizers, raw sewage, and untreated wastewater discharged in Bued River. So this could be from built-up areas which directed their sewage lines and is directly connected to the Bued River. Okay, so now we go to the watershed management. So this is some of review of related literature that researchers already studied how land use affected watershed health or watershed quality. So we have a study from the US which studied land use and watershed health. So they have two tables here of findings how toxic water is or affects urban area, pastures, and others. So we can see that on table 4, the first two columns show the impact of alternate land use on conventional water quality. So there is a strong evidence that converting forests, to intensive agriculture and urban development contributes to conventional water pollution in the United States. So there is a 1% increase in cultivated cropland. So if we convert this to acres, this is approximately 1,674 for an average watershed. So increase in the number of cultivated cropland exceeded the national reference level for conventional water quality by 0.22% in an average watershed, while a 1% increase in developed land, so this is the built-up area, increases the number of samples in exceedance of the national reference level for conventional water quality by 0.05. Now, even though these levels are low, when they are actually converted to the area of the land in square meters or in acres, malaki na yung impact nito. Okay? So, moreover, with the table 4, converting forest land to pasture also increases conventional water pollution. So there is a 1% increase in pasture land. So this increases the number of samples in exceedance of the national reference level by conventional water quality by 0.07%. So again, as you can see, these percentages are low. But again, converted to a land area, okay, malaki na yung magiging effect nito or magiging sakop nung conversions na to. For table 4, columns 3 and 4 show the impact of alternative land uses on toxic water quality. So, converting forest land to transportation of mining will significantly increase the probability of toxic water pollution. So a 1% increase in the amount of land allocated to transportation and mining is expected to increase the number of samples in exceedance of the national chronic level of toxic water quality by 0.57% and 0.02% respectively. Lastly, okay, the last two columns of table 4 show the impact of alternative land use variables on the number of endangered species on average watershed. The conventional water quality variable is statistically significant at the 1% level. A 1% increase in the percent of samples exceeding the national reference level for conventional water quality is expected to increase the number of endangered aquatic species by about 0.03%. Okay, so now we go to table 5. So in table 5, this talks about urban development and the conversion of forests to pasture lands and converting forest land to highways and mining. Okay, so table 5, table 5. So converting 1% of forest land into urban development increases the percentage of samples in exceedance of the national reference level for conventional water quality by 0.29%. It has about the same impact as converting the same amount of forest to cultivated cropland, but as a slightly larger impact than converting forest to pasture land on a per acre basis. So basically, converting forest land to highways and mining both increases toxic water pollution, but transportation has a much larger impact than mining on a per acre basis. So moreover, in this study, they talked about how converting 1% of forest land to transportation can increase the percentage of samples in exceedance of the national chronic level for toxic water quality by 7.61%. Okay, so we can see now with this study how land use really affects watershed health, not only from the water quality but also the aquatic life that is present in the watershed. So next is we go to the to Nepal. So Nepal is actually a watershed conservation success story that spanned from 1976 to 2006. So their methods of assessment of environmental changes and economic benefits were they identified erosion plots and soil loss equations, so they can measure and estimate erosion rates as an indicator of watershed health, and to be able to identify land use categories as priorities of watershed restoration. So, sorry. Okay, so these are the benefits, or these were the conclusion that they had after 30 years of watershed conservation. Excuse me. So watershed health improved significantly from 1978 to 2006, reversing apparent trends. So nearly second is water quality in the watershed in Nepal has deteriorated over the past 30 years. So with increasing nutrient loading, mainly from municipal sources in nearby municipals of the watershed. So rather than from upland watershed agriculture runoff. Recent road construction contributes significantly to amounts of sediment to the lake. So nearly all formerly eroded grazing and shrublands, so that's 25% of the watershed, became protected pasture or community forest. So this both benefits and costs were underestimated in the 1978 plan, but benefits still greatly exceeded costs nearly 30 years later, that was in 2006. While local forest user groups were a major factor in watershed improvement, collaboration with NGOs and government agencies were important in for ongoing technical advice and mediation services. So they had a sense of well-being and pride in watershed improvements. So was expressed by many farmers in the watershed, both men and women. So development activities in the watershed began with a top-down emphasis on structural conservation measures. So I think yun nga, hindi naman agad-agad that we can restore Buwed watershed. Okay, but we can learn from the watershed conservation success story of Nepal. Okay, so okay. So that is the current status quo that we have for land use planning, for Buwed watershed, and for watershed management studies that were already done, where they were able to link how land use planning affected watersheds. So now we will be talking about how far we've come with Buwed watershed. So what are our key wins? So our key wins is we already have a setup of stations. We have already documented some things for Buwed watershed, like the built-up area, the land coverage area, characterization of Buwed watershed, and we have a review of related literature that would reinforce how land use planning or land use models affects watershed management. So what is our goal now? Okay, so now we will be talking about our new goals. Okay, so our new goals would be to develop a land use model, and at the same time a land use criteria that would help our policy makers or guide them, okay, to be able to preserve or restore Buwed watershed and manage it properly in the future. Okay, so with our new goals, what do we aim to improve? So we want to improve land allocation near watershed. Okay, because in our discussion we have discussed that a lot of land conversion, okay, affects the watershed health or the water quality, even the aquatic life that are living in the watershed. So with this land allocation near the watershed, we want to control the built-up environment, okay, the putting up of residential houses, because land resource is scarce. Okay, it is a renewable resource, but it takes a lot of years for it to be renewed. So probably some people are already forced, okay, to put up their houses, put up their residences, okay, in supposed to be protected areas, okay. just to be able to accommodate the growing population. So we can see how a lot of things can actually affect land use planning, okay, or land use models, land use criteria, okay. So at the same time, we want to control, okay, with our land use model and our land use criteria, we want to control the activities, okay, near the watershed. And if ever they will have these sorts of activities like mining, okay, construction of highways, construction for transportation, we would be guiding them, okay, the proximity of these activities from the watershed so as not to affect the watershed health. That goes the same for built up environment, okay. What would be the proximity of built up environment from the watershed? So there will be an easement, there will be a setback, okay. So you cannot build, probably, let's say 50 or 25 kilometers from the watershed will be a non-buildable area, not because it is a disaster risk. It's because we want to preserve watershed, we want to manage it properly, okay. So we can take pride and joy, okay, that we have a good watershed health or watershed quality. Excuse me. So what could be the probable impact of this? So as I've mentioned, okay, we will have a sense of well-being and pride. So the quality of water in the Bued watershed will basically improve, okay, and which will overall improve the watershed health, okay, and it will be an ideal home, okay, for aquatic life that we have in the Bued watershed. So next is we go to the next steps that we can take. So we have land use model again and land use criteria. So these are the next steps that we need to take. So what is our step one? Oops, sorry. So step one. So step one, which we already did, we have the review of related literature. So again, this was already reinforced by studies that was done in the US, in Nepal, okay, where they saw how land use models or land use policies affected watershed health. Then we also have to analyze the CLUP of Tuba and Baguio, and at the same time the regional development plan of the Cordillera Administrative Region. Now I saw some parts already of the CLUP of Baguio where it talked about watershed management. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the one from Tuba. So if we could see the overlaps, okay, on watershed management in the CLUPs of Tuba and Baguio, then we can see if they are actually aligned or medyo hindi sila nagkakatugma. Now, again, I think I've mentioned this in a few slides back that it would be nice, no, if our municipal leaders or city leaders would talk among themselves how they would be aligning their CLUPs, okay, since Bued watershed runs from one municipal to another. Okay, so next, step 2 is we have it would be nice if we would have data of built up environment along the Bued watershed in Tuba and Baguio from 2015 to 2020, and then the data of water quality in Bued watershed from 2015 to 2020, because basically with these two data we can see Okay, if there has been an increase of built-up area along the Buwed watershed, and definitely with the data on water quality, we can see how if the built-up area actually affected the water quality in Buwed watershed. Okay, so yeah, that is the step 2. So in step 3, basically this is where we digest all the information from step 1 to step 2. So we analyze data. As I mentioned, this is the built-up area or the land coverage area and the water quality. So basically you just have to compare them. We just have to compare them and see how or if the built-up area actually affected the water quality of the Buwed watershed. Then cross-referencing of the CLUPs and the regional development plan. And lastly, of course, from all of those, we can be able to formulate a land use model and a land use criteria for the proper management of Buwed watershed. Okay, so that is all for my discussion on watershed land use. Have a good day.